In the holy name of Jesus, we begin our sharing on the Bible study this morning on Judges chapter 19.
奉主耶稣基督圣名开始我们今天早晨的查经学习士师记第19章。
Now, we have learned previously of the idolatry which stems from Micah in chapter 17.
我们之前学习到在士师记17章这个拜偶像的行为是从弥迦那边开始的。
And in chapter 18, how the Danites adopted the same idolatry.
那在18章提到但人并且夺取弥迦的偶像。
Now we find that in both chapters 18 and 19, they open with the news that there is no king of Israel.
我们知道在18章和19章他们都是以就是以色列中当时没有王这个来开始的。
Now, not having a king of Israel meant more than the absence of a monarch.
就是当时是没有在以色列中没有王，就是说当时是没有这个王室的存在。
The true meaning here is that the Israelites refused to recognize God's leadership over them.
那其实这里的意思主要是因为以色列人他们拒绝来把神当成是他们的王，当成是他们的带领者。
And so without God's leadership, the people would sink into acts of depravity.
那如果没有神的带领的话呢，那么神的百姓这些人呢，他们都会处在一个缺乏的状态。
With everyone just doing what was right in their own eyes.
每个人都是行他们自己个人眼中看为正的事情。
And in the remaining chapters of the book of Judges, we learn of such acts.
那在剩下的士师记的几章当中呢，我们可以看到这些百姓他们是任意而行的作为。
And here in chapter 19, we learn of a terrible story.
所以在19章的话，我们将会学到一个非常可怕的故事。
And I have to say that on first reading, the story is so distasteful that it makes you wonder why it appears in the scriptures at all.
所以就是当我读这一章的时候呢，我会就感觉就不能理解为什么这一章会出现在在这本圣经当中。
But actually, the more you delve into the contents of this chapter, the more you come to realize the importance of this tragic story told.
但是当我们如果越仔细来查考这一章的时候呢，我们会发现为什么这样子的悲剧会发生。
Now, in chapter 1 of verse 1 of chapter 19, we learn that a certain Levite priest took for himself a concubine.
在第19章的第1节，我们看到有一个利未人，他娶了犹大伯利恒的妻子女子为妾。
And the Levite's concubine was recognized as his legal partner.
所以就是这个他的妾呢，就算是他合法的这个伴侣。
But as it was in those days, the concubine did not have the same status in the home or the society as a wife.
但是呢，就是在当时他们当地的那边的地方的话呢，作为妾的话，在他们当地是没有这个身份的。
And this was at this time a widely accepted practice.
所以当时在那个时候呢，这样子的行为是非常是大家都可以接受的行为。
And in fact, if we scour through the Old Testament scriptures, we find that many prominent men in the Old Testament had concubines.
所以当我们如果来仔细查考看这些旧约的时候呢，我们会发现那些非常突出有名的这些男的都是有娶女子为妾的这个行为。
And these include Abraham, as recorded in Genesis chapter 25.
就比如说亚伯拉罕在创世纪的25章有提到。
We have Jacob, who's recorded in Genesis 35.
同样的，雅各在创世纪35章也有提到他娶妾的事情。
Caleb, who is recorded in First Chronicles chapter 2.
这个加勒呢，在那个列王在历代志上22章也有提到。
And the list goes on. Saul, David, Solomon, and Rehoboam all had concubines.
那这些娶妻的行为，到大卫、到扫罗、到罗波安，他们都有这种娶女子为妾的行为。
But significantly, we never see this kind of family life blessed by God.
但其实，如果我们从这种意义上面来看的话呢，这个娶妾的行为都没有被神受到神的祝福。
And the New Testament scriptures makes it clear that from the beginning, God's plan was one man and one woman to be one flesh forever.
但是如果我们在新约的时候呢，我们可以看到，其实神起初的旨意就是，就是一对夫妻只有一男一女才成为一对夫妻。
We turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 19.
我们请看马太福音书19章。
Matthew chapter 19, and we read verses 4 to 6.
我们请看第4节到第6节。
And he answered and said to them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? Verse 5. And said, For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Verse 6. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate.
第4节，耶稣回答说：“那起初造人的是造男造女，并且说，因此人要离开父母，与妻子联合，二人成为一体。这经你们没有练过吗？”第6节，既然如此，夫妻不再是两个人，乃是一体了。所以神所配合的，人不可分开。
So it is clear that each man is to be a one-woman man.
所以这里很清楚的告诉我们，一个男人只是属于一个女人的。
So we turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3.
我们请看提摩太前书第3章。
1 Timothy chapter 3, and we read verses 2 and 3.
我们请看第2节到第3节。
A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Verse 3, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous.
第2节，做监督的必须无可指责，只做一个妇人的丈夫，有节制，自守端正，乐意接待远人，善于教导，不因酒滋事，不打人，只要温和，不争竞，不贪财。
And despite God's guidance, we find that during these times that the people of Israel, and specifically in the time of Judges, were idolaters and covetous, meaning that they were greedy for wealth.
但是尽管神是这么的教导的他们，但是我们可以在4世纪可以看到呢，以色列百姓他们还是照样的是贪财并且拜偶像。
Now we turn back to the book of Judges, chapter 19, and we read verses 2 to 4.
我们再看回4世纪19章第2节到第4节。
Judges chapter 19, verses 2 to 4.
4世纪19章第2节到第4节。
But his concubine played the harlot against him, and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 whole months. Verse 3. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So he brought so she brought him into her father's house. And when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Verse 4. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with them 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there.
第2节，妾行营离开丈夫，回犹大伯利恒，到了父家，在那里住了4个月。她丈夫起来，带着一个仆人、两匹驴去见她，用好话劝她回来。女子就引丈夫进入父家，她父见的那人便欢欢喜喜的迎接。那人的岳父就是女子的父亲，将那人留下住了3天，于是2人一同吃喝住宿。
Now, in these verses, we learn that the Levite's concubine had been unfaithful. She had played the harlot.
所以在这几节我们可以看到呢，这个利未人的妾呢，她是不忠的，她就是行淫离开她的丈夫。
Now, if we read wider in the Old Testament scriptures, we come to learn that this is representative of the sin of Israel.
所以，如果我们再去参考其他这些旧约的章节的话呢，我们会发现这个利未人妾她的行为呢，就是代表了象征了以色列人所犯的这些罪。
We turn to the book of Hosea, chapter 9, and we read the first part of verse 8.
我们请看何西阿书第9章第8节的上半部分。
Hosea chapter 9, and we read the first part of verse 8.
我们请看何西阿书第9章第8节的上半部分。
Do not rejoice, O Israel, with joy like other peoples, for you have played the harlot against your God.
Sorry. Hosea chapter 9, verse 8. I think that's not.
Sorry, let me just check. Is it 10 verse 8? Let me see. Hosea. Verse 8. Sorry. Okay, I will try to find that verse, but if we could turn also to Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 27.
为什么请看耶利米书13章的27节。
Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 27.
耶利米书13章27节。
Here in Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 27, I have seen your adulterers and your lustful neighings, the lewdness of your harlotry, your abominations on the hills of the fields. Woe to you, O Jerusalem! Will you still not be made clean?
期间，你那些可憎恶之事，就是在田野的山上行奸淫、发失声、做淫乱的事，我都看见了。耶路撒冷啊，你有祸了！你不肯洁净，还要到几时呢？
If I find the verse in Hosea, I'll come back to it. We move on.
我们请看我们如果找到何西阿书的时候呢，就会回来。我们先再看接下去的章节。
Perhaps it is no accident in the story of the unnamed woman that she came from Bethlehem.
那其实呢，我们这里可以看到呢，这个利民的妇人呢，她是来自犹大的伯利恒。
Which, as we know, was the home of King David.
我们知道那个地方呢，其实就是大卫的大卫来自的地方。
And we know that King David himself committed adultery with Bathsheba.
我们同样也知道大卫王他也跟这个巴示巴也有犯这个通奸的罪。
Leading him to arrange the death of her husband Uriah the Hittite.
导致这个巴士巴的丈夫这个乌利亚的死亡。
And we will find that there are some other similarities to King David as the chapter unfolds.
所以当我们越接去看那些章节的时候呢，我们会发现跟大卫王身上所犯的一样的事情都是也会发生。
As we read on through Judges chapter 19, it appears that the Levite has a heart of forgiveness to pursue her back, the concubine back, by going to her father's house.
所以当我们在读4世纪19章的时候呢，我们会发现这个利未人好像是有一个非常想要原谅他妾的心，因为他的行为就是去到了他妾的父家。
And some biblical scholars have speculated as to whether the concubine was actually unfaithful to the Levite.
其实有很多那些其他的那些书有提到，就是说是否这个利未人的妾是真的对她的丈夫不忠，
or whether in fact they had a serious argument resulting in her fleeing back to her father's house.
或者有没有可能是因为他们两个人他们有那个非常激烈的争吵，导致他的妾离开了利未人而回到他的父家去。
However, the term harlot is used here in the narrative in the book of Judges.
但是我们这里在在这个4世纪这里可以看到呢，他们这里用到的是行淫，
which seems more in keeping or more in parallel with the sins of Israel.
其实这里就好像就是就有点是好比以色列人他们所犯的那些罪一样。
And we learn from verses 5 to 10 in Judges chapter 19 that the Levite stayed in his father-in-law's house with his concubine for 5 days.
所以从我们4世纪19章第5节到第10节，我们可以看到利未人在他的妾父家中待了有5天，
where he drank with his father-in-law, who wanted the Levite to be merry and refresh his heart.
所以他当时是跟他的岳父一同吃喝住宿，因为他的岳父希望他可以加添心力，并且畅快他的心。
So we can also learn here that the Levite was prone to taking wine.
所以我们这里可以看到呢，这个利未人呢，他是喝酒非常厉害的。
Now, the father of the concubine wanted the Levite to stay longer.
但是我们可以看到，这个妾的父亲呢，是想要让利未人在他们家多待一段日子。
But the Levite was impatient and wanted to leave with his concubine.
但是利未人他确实没有这个耐心，他想要尽快与他的妾离开他的岳父家。
So we learn that on the evening of the 5th day, the Levite and his reunited concubine loaded 2 donkeys later in the evening and journeyed opposite to Jezbus, which is Jerusalem.
所以呢，我们知道在第10节可以看到，在第5天的晚上呢，利未人就带着他他的妾呢一起起身离开他的岳父家，来到耶布斯的对面，耶布斯就是耶路撒冷。
Now we know that Jerusalem at that time was occupied by the Jebusites.
我们知道当时的耶路撒冷呢是被耶布斯人所掌控的，
who were not of the people of Israel.
他们是不属以色列人。
So although his concubine had suggested staying in Jerusalem,
尽管他的妾有建议让他们待在耶路撒冷，
the Levite did not want to stay in a place full of foreigners.
但是这个利未人呢，他却不想待在一个都是外邦人的一个地方，
preferring instead to stay amongst his own people of Israel.
但是他却更希望住在他的同胞里面，就是以色列同胞里。 的地方。
So we learn in these passages that he suggested to his concubine that they should head for either Gibeah or Ramah.
所以我们可以看到，这个利未人他建议他们就可以到一个地方，要么是在基比亚，要么就是在拉玛居住。
But as they continued their journey, the sun was setting and night was coming.
其实，当他们继续在他们的路程当中呢，日头已经落了。
And they found themselves closest to the city of Gibeah.
之后，他们发现他们离基比亚这个城呢是更加的接近。
Now, the city of Gibeah was the home of the Benjamites.
所以我们知道呢，基比亚城呢就是便雅悯人所居住的地方。
So they turned into the city and headed for an open square in the town center, seeking someone to provide them hospitality.
所以当他们进入基比亚的时候呢，他们就坐在城里的街上，因为他们想要有人可以来邀请他们进入他们家去住宿。
Now, this is quite an irony because the concubine wanted them to go to Jebus, which is Jerusalem.
所以这里有点讽刺的是，当他的妾想要他们去在耶布斯，就是耶路撒冷居住的时候。
But the Levite said that he didn't want to go there because the Jebusites were foreigners.
但是这个利未人他却不愿意，因为他认为说这些耶布斯人呢是外邦人。
So here he is in Gibeah amongst his own people, the Benjamites, and yet no one were offering to take them into their houses.
但是呢，就很讽刺的是，当他进入到他的同胞，也就是便雅悯人居住的地方呢，却没有人来接他们进家住宿。
So it seems that they were being treated as unwelcome foreigners.
好像就是他们被当成是不受欢迎的外邦人一样。
And so they could find initially no hospitality in Gibeah.
所以他们会发现，在基比亚当中呢，他们没有这种热心接待人的这个行为。
Now, this is a poor reflection on the people of Gibeah.
所以这个是基比亚人，他们应该要好好的就是去反省的一个地方。
Because God commanded such hospitality among the people of God.
因为神有要他们有吩咐他们，就是要用热心来接待人。
We turn to the book of Leviticus, chapter 19.
我们请看利未记19章。
Leviticus, chapter 19,
利未
and
记
we read verses 33 and 34.
我们请看33节到34节。
And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
33节，若有外人在你们国中和你同居，就不可欺负他；和你们同居的外人，你们要看他如本地人一样，并要爱他如己，因为你们在埃及地也做过寄居的。我是主你们的神。
And we also know from the New Testament scriptures that God will judge all of the nation for their deeds towards others.
所以我们知道，在新约也有提到，神呢会按照个人对待人的方式呢来审判他们。
And Jesus encourages us to help those who are in need.
所以主耶稣他也勉励我们要来帮助那些需要帮助的人。
And we often use a phrase, a friend in need is a friend indeed.
所以我们经常会用一句话，就是说，一个真正的朋友呢，就是在他需要帮助的时候呢，我们去给予帮助他。
We turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 25, and we read verse 35.
我们请看马太福音25章35节。
Matthew chapter 25, verse 35.
马太福音25章35节。
For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in.
35节，因为我饿了，你们给我吃；渴了，你们给我喝；我做客旅，你们留我住。
So we also learn from the moral directions given in the book of Hebrews.
我们同样的也在希伯来书也可以所学习到待人的方式。
We turn briefly to Hebrews chapter 13 and we read verses 1 and 2.
我们请看希伯来书13章第1节到第2节。
Hebrews chapter 13 verses 1 and 2.
希伯来书13章第1节到第2节。
Let brotherly love continue. Verse 2. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels.
第1节，你们务要长存弟兄相爱的心，不可忘记用爱心接待客旅，因为曾有接待客旅的，不知不觉就接待了天使。
So there is therefore something clearly wrong here in Gibeah.
所以我们可以看到，在基比亚是有一个非常大的问题。
There is no apparent hospitality amongst God's people.
在神的百姓当中呢，他们没有存这种爱心，还有这种接待的这种爱心。
And this is to symbolize it's a further indication of how the people of Israel had so drifted apart from God.
这同样也可以展示表明了以色列的百姓，他们是离神是越来越远。
They couldn't even extend hospitality to their own people.
他们甚至都没有办法用爱心来接待他们的同胞。
We turn back to the book of Judges, chapter 19.
我们就请看回士师记19章。
And if we read through verses 16 to 18,
我们再看16节到18节。
We learned that an old man was returning from his labors in the field.
这里我们可以看到一个老年人从田间做工回来。
And it so turns out that he was an Ephraimite.
所以这里可以看到呢，他也是以法莲人。
And he was from the mountains of Ephraim, where the Levite priest was from.
他也是住在以法莲山，也是这个利未人他所住的地方。
And the old man asked where they had come from, which was Bethlehem in Judah.
所以这个老年人就问利未人他们来自哪里，并且说这利未人说他们是从犹大伯利恒来的。
And they said, the Levites said that we're heading to the mountains of Ephraim.
利未人也回答他们要往以法莲山地那边去。
And the Levite describes in verse 18 as they are going to the house of the Lord.
所以这里利未人在18节也有提到，他是要往神的殿去。
So sorry, in chapter 18, verse 31.
在士师记的18章31节。
Now I'm going to the house of the Lord. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh.
31节，神的殿在示罗多少日子，但人为自己设立米迦所雕刻的像，也在但多少日子。
So as we learned last week, that the house of the Lord was not in Jerusalem, but at Shiloh.
所以我们上个星期有学习到的，就是说神的殿呢，它不是在耶路撒冷，乃是在示罗那里。
So after the initial dialogue between the old man and the Levite,
我们可以看到这个老年人与利未人他这个起初的这个聊天的记录。
he, his servant, and his concubine were made to be very welcome in the old man's house.
可以看到利未人跟他的仆人还有他的妾都是非常被欢迎的邀请到了这个老年人的家。
And we learn in verse 19 that the old man provided everything they needed.
所以我们19节可以看到呢，这个老年人为他们预备了他们所需要的一切。
And this act of kindness by the old man is very reminiscent of the teachings in the book of Matthew.
所以我们可以看到呢，这个老年人的善行呢，跟这个马太福音那里所提到的呢，是非常的相同。
We turn briefly to the book of Matthew.
我们请看马太福音。
And we read chapter 6 and we read verses 33 and 34.
我们请看第6章第33节和34节。
But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. 34. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble.
33节，你们要先求他的国和他的义，这些东西都要加给你们了。所以不要为明天忧虑，因为明天自有明天的忧虑，一天的难处，一天当就够了。
Now, in Judges chapter 19, verse 21,
在士师记的19章21节，
it says that they were taken in and they washed their feet.
这里可以看到呢，老年人领他们到家里，他们就洗脚吃喝。
And we know so well the sacrament of foot washing from John chapter 13.
我们非常的了解到约翰福音13章那里提到的洗脚礼。
But symbolically, we know from John chapter 13 that Jesus knew his hour was coming.
我们知道在约翰福音13章的时候呢，可以看到主耶稣他知道他的时候将到了。
So he performed the sacrament of foot washing upon his disciples.
所以主耶稣就在他的门徒当中就行了这个洗脚礼。
And this was during his Last Supper, the feast of the Passover, before his death and resurrection.
就是在主耶稣死之前，还有升天复活之前呢，就是在逾越节的晚餐，逾越节的时候，就他最后的晚餐的时候，他就行了洗脚礼。
But after this foot washing and during this feast amongst the disciples, Jesus identifies his betrayer.
就是在主耶稣行了完成洗脚礼，就是在他们宴席的当中的时候呢，主耶稣就向他们告知谁是将要出卖主耶稣的人。
Now, I see it that there are strong parallels here in this chapter of the book of Judges.
所以我感觉就是当时主耶稣所发生的那时候洗脚礼所发生的事情，跟这个士师记19章将要发生的事情呢，是有点相似的。
With what was about to happen next in the story of the unnamed woman, the Levite's concubine.
就是将要发生在利未人这个利民的妾身上的事情。
As we read on in this chapter, we learn of a sordid and serious crime so grisly it is difficult to convey.
所以我们这里将要所学习到的是一个非常让人难以接受这种可怕的事件罪行。
But we also know in the remaining chapters of Judges that the incident that is about to unfold had a profound effect on the people of Israel.
所以我们之后将要所学习到这个将要发生的事情呢，对以色列整个支派都有一个非常大的这个影响。
So from Judges chapter 19, verse 22, we learn that while the Levite, his concubine and servant were enjoying the hospitality in the old man's house,
19章的22节，我们看到利未人和他的仆人，还有他的妾，在老年人家中心里正欢畅的时候，
that a number of perverted male Benjamites from the town began to surround the house where they were feasting.
这些城中的匪徒呢，就是城中的这些便雅悯人，他们就把这个房子给围住。
They were chanting and demanding that the Levite comes outside so that they can have their evil way with him.
那就是来就是要求这个利未人出来，使他们可以与他行这种恶行。
And this is remarkably similar to the incident recorded in Genesis chapter 19, when the house of Lot in Sodom was surrounded by deprived males intent on having their evil ways.
所以这里的故事呢，跟出埃及记的19章当时就是发生在罗德家的故事呢，是非常的相似。
And this confirms that the depravity during the time of Judges was as bad as occurred in Sodom and Gomorrah.
所以我们可以看到这个时候4世纪他们这些人所犯的这些罪行呢，跟索多玛他们那两个和俄摩拉两个城所犯的罪行是非常的相似，都是非常的邪恶。
So as we read on, we find that despite the old man of the house pleading with the sex-starved mob,
就是当我们可以看到，就是这个老年人呢，他就是阻止不让这些匪徒去做他们要做的这些罪行。
this is recorded in verse 23.
这个是在23节可以看到。
And then in verse 24, an alternative is offered.
但我们24节可以看到呢，这个老年人就想了一个另外的一个方法来解决这个问题。
The old man offers to send out his virgin daughter to the mob.
所以这里可以看到呢，这个老年人呢，就把他的这个两个女儿还是处女的两个女儿，想要献给这些匪徒。
And this was instead of sending out the Levite's concubine.
然后这个同样的就是他想要把这个利未人的妾呢，也想要一起交出去。
But eventually we learned that the Levite threw the concubine out of the door to the hungry mob outside.
那我们之后也可以学习到，这个利未人呢，就把他的妾给拉出去，交给这一群饥渴的这些匪徒。
And we learned, sadly and tragically, that the concubine was abused relentlessly by the mob all night.
所以我们这里也可以看到，这个利未人的妾呢，她就是被这一群匪徒终夜凌辱。
But actually, when I pondered on this grisly episode at this point,
就当我看到就是这一章这些发生的这些恶行的时候，
if we are to accept in the early verses of chapter 19 that this concubine had truly played the harlot,
如果我们相信，就是可以接受说，这个一开始利未人的妾呢，她是真的是不忠有行淫的话，
then as grisly as the episode was, it may be tinged with a slight air of legitimacy.
所以我的
It might have been, there may have been a slight amount of legitimacy in the Levite throwing the concubine to the mob.
所以我们可以看到，好像就是利未人把他的妻子把他这个妾呢拉出去给这群匪徒，好像看起来是合法可以这么做的，因为他的妻子如果是真的行淫的话。
Now, we know in the Old Testament times that women were most definitely subservient to men.
所以我们知道，在这旧约时代呢，就是这些女人的地位呢，都是不
And
高
we
的，
know
他们
that
都要去他们之下。
we know that unfaithful wives, their punishment was death.
我们知道，如果一个不忠的妻子呢，他们的结局，他们的惩罚就是死。
We turn to the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, and we read verse 10.
我们请看利未记20章第10节。
Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10.
利未记20章第10节。
The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death.
第4节，与邻居之妻行淫的奸夫淫妇都必治死。
Now, we read on in the same chapter of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 13.
我们再请看本章的第13节。
If a man lies with a male and he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them.
13节，人若与男人苟合，像与女人一样，他们二人行了可憎的事，总要把他们治死，罪要归到他们身上。
So if we look at this incident and we take the Levitical laws into consideration,
所以，如果我们来看到当时发生在这个4世纪19章的事情，并且要来把这个再来思考利未记当时的这个律法的话，
here we have the Levite's concubine, who is a harlot. That means she has committed adultery.
所以我们这里可以看到呢，利未人的这个妾呢，她是淫妇，因为她就是不忠行淫。
So one could say that the Levite's choice was justified to sacrifice the concubine because the law is clear that adultery means she shall be put to death.
所以我们可能会认为说，利未人他做的这些事情呢，把他的妾推出去是可以的，因为他所做的事情就是这里所提到的，防范奸淫的妇人都必致死。
So here we can see in this situation that the old man had offered his virgin daughter, who was entirely innocent of any crime, and therefore rightfully she should not be turned over to the mob.
但是，我们同样的在这里也可以看到，这个老年人把他2个无辜的女儿，没有犯过任何罪行的女儿，都拉出去给这些匪徒。
The Levite himself was innocent of adultery, as far as we are aware.
那我们到目前为止，我们都晓得这个利未人呢，他是在这个婚姻上他是忠心的，他没有做不忠的事情。
But in fact, if the Levite had handed himself over to the mob,
那如果我们想一下，利未人他如果把自己交给这群匪徒的话呢？
then he could have been, if he had survived the attacks, then he could have been found guilty under the Levitical law of a homosexual act.
那么，如果这个利未人他如果活下来的话呢，那么他们就会判他有罪的，因为他所犯的这个罪呢，就是行同性的这个罪。
And this is quite clear from Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13.
所以这个在利未记20章13节可以非常的清楚看到。
So it appears that the Levite and the situation in the old man's house left no alternative but to throw the concubine to the wolves.
好像在这里我们感觉就是利未人跟这个老年人好像除了只有把他的这个妾拉出去给这些匪徒以外，没有任何的这种解决方法。
So we turn back to Judges chapter 19 and we look at verses 26 to 28.
我们再看回士师记19章26节到28节。
And we learn that the concubine had been at the mercy of the deprived mob all night.
我们知道呢，就是这个他利未人的妾呢，就是被这一群匪徒给终夜凌辱。
And tragically, in the morning, was found dead on the doorstep of the old man's house.
非常可悲的是，这个妇人到了天快亮的时候呢，她就是死在了这个她主人住宿的房门前。
Now, it's quite mercenary, but if we read verse 26,
如果我们可以看26节的话，
we find in verse 26, Judges chapter 19, verse 26, that following the savage death of the Levite's concubine,
那就是在这个利未人的妾这种悲惨的这种死法的时候，
that he is no longer referred to as the husband, but the master.
我们会看到呢，这个利未人他的身份就改变为了他妾的主人，而不是他妾的丈夫。
And this really symbolizes the heartless nature of the Levite.
所以这个真的就是象征了，代表了这个利未人这种无心，没有这种没心没肺的这种人。
No sooner as his concubine dies, he reverts to master rather than husband.
就是当他的这个妾死了之后呢，他就把他的身份改成为他妾的主人，而不是丈夫。
It is like he is emotionally unaffected by the savage incident.
所以他好像是从这种野蛮的这种行为举动当中呢，他都没有他的那种情感都没有受到什么任何的影响。
But we learn from this story to this point that actually no one here is innocent.
所以其实我们直到现在这个点，我们都知道说，没有任何一个人在这里是无辜的。
The old man offered his virgin daughter. He is guilty.
那这个老年人呢，把他两个无辜的女儿呢拿去献出去的话呢，也是说这个老年人是有罪的。
And the concubine, the Levite threw the concubine to the hungry mob.
那这个利未人也把他的妾拉出去给这一群匪徒，这行为
But
也是。
in reading this story, I just speculate as to whether she actually really was a harlot.
所以其实直到现在，当我读到这里的时候呢，我其实就在猜测，到底他的这个利未人妾是否真的是个淫妇，
Or did she just flee from the Levite back to her father's house due to his heartless nature, his unreasonableness?
或者是有没有可能是因为这个利未人的妾，他之所以要离开利未人，有可能是因为利未人是个没心没肺的人。
If she really was a harlot, why did she go back to her father's house and stay just with him for 4 months?
那如果他的妾如果真的是这个淫妇，有犯奸淫的话，那么为什么他要回到他父家去待整整4个月呢？
And perhaps a stronger clue is, why did the Levite go back to seek her out?
那最大的线索是，为什么这个利未人之后还要回去把他的妾给找回来呢？劝他回来呢？
The Levitical laws were very clear. An unfaithful wife would be put to death.
这个利未人的律法是非常的清楚，只要有犯奸淫的这个妇人呢，就应当被致死。
So why did the Levite not have her put to death much earlier in the story?
所以这利未人如果他的妻子真的有犯奸淫的话，为什么他不一开始就直接把他的这个妾给致死呢？
We can only speculate on this matter.
所以在这件事情上面呢，我们只能去猜测。
But as a harlot, this sad, sordid, and tragic story of the fate of this concubine
所以当我们这里可以看到呢，这个他利未人妾他这种悲惨的结局，
it reminded me of the adulteress who was forgiven by Jesus in John chapter 8.
这里就让我想到了在约翰福音书第8章，主耶稣原谅了一个妓女一样。
And we turn briefly to John chapter 8, verse 7.
我们请看约翰福音第8章第7节。
And here we have a further reminder to those who would accuse her of sin.
所以这里有看到很多人就是在谴责、在责怪他所犯的这个罪。
And Jesus said, "He who is without sin amongst you, let him throw the stone first at her."
那主耶稣就对他们说：“你们中间谁是没有罪的，谁就可以先拿石头打他。”
But what then happens to the concubine after her tragic death?
在这个妇人在这个妾悲惨的结局的时候呢，之后发生了什么？
Is that we learn unprecedentedly that the Levite cut up her body into pieces and sordidly distributed the different members of her body to the remainder of the tribes of Israel.
所以我们会接下来看到这种在以色列上史无前例所发生的事情。这个利未人用刀将他妾的尸身切成12块，使人拿着传送以色列的事迹。
Why did he do this? For nothing like this had ever been done before.
为什么利未人要行这种从来都没有行过的事情呢？
This was obviously a grotesque way of sending out a message of sin to the rest of the tribes.
这个就是要把这种罪的这种行为呢，来传送给以色列的12个支派。
We turn to the final verse in Hosea chapter 10, verse 9.
我们再看回最后一节，何西阿书的10章第9节。
Hosea chapter 10, verse 9.
何西阿书第10章第9节。
O Israel, you have sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood, the battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity. Do not overtake them.
以色列啊，你从基比亚的日子以来，时常犯罪。你们的先人曾站在那里，现今住基比亚的人，以为攻击罪孽之辈的战士，领不到自己。
So, what follows in the remaining chapters of the book of Judges?
在这个4世纪19章，在4世纪之后的接下来的章节。
Actually reveals the result of this incident of the unnamed woman and the crime committed at Gibeah.
接下来所发生的事情都是，就是因着这个利米的妇人还有基比亚的罪行之后，所发生的事件。
And perhaps a clue as to what is to come in the remaining chapters.
之后剩下的4世纪的几章所要发生的线索呢，都可以从这个事件中看到。
Can be paralleled to David, as I mentioned earlier.
其实可以跟大卫他所犯的罪呢是类同的。
After David's adultery with Bathsheba and arranging the death of her husband,
就是在大卫和巴示巴通奸之后，并且安排了去杀巴示巴的丈夫的事情之后，
we learn that David's son schemes to overthrow David.
我们知道大卫的儿子呢，他就用这个计谋想要去夺取他的王位。
We learn that David flees from Jerusalem,
我们也学习到大卫就逃离耶路撒冷，
but returns after Absalom's death, his son, to rule Israel.
直到他的儿子押沙龙死了之后呢，他才重新回到耶路撒冷重新当王。
My sharing ends here. Amen.
我的分享到此结束，阿门。